was that statement from Senator Ernst on your candidacy?
Well, we're grateful that she said she's going to support us through that process.
The accusations about mismanaging money and about non-consensual behavior, if they come forward, I will listen to those accusations, but they have to be credible.
Most economists agree the new administration is going to inherit a fairly strong economy. That is my profound hope that the new administration will preserve and build on this progress.
Hello, everyone. I'm Major Garrett in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. Some of President-elect Trump's cabinet picks are, as you might expect, back on Capitol Hill this week, continuing their quest for Senate support as they can put it together ahead of confirmation hearings early next year. Today saw Defense Secretary pick Pete Hegseth, pick for Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard, and Kash Patel, who has been selected to lead the FBI, though we should point out there is no current vacancy at the top of that law enforcement agency, but there very well may be in the not too distant future. Of course, what's key about these meetings is not that they are happening, but the approach potential cabinet members are taking as they shift positions in order to seal the deal. That includes Hegseth and his stance on women in the military. This is how Hegseth described it on Fox News last night.
Some of our greatest warriors, our best warriors out there are women who serve. I look forward to being a secretary for all our warriors, men and women.
We start tonight with Scott MacFarlane on Capitol Hill, and a big part of his attention has been devoted to those named by President-elect Trump to cabinet positions in the incoming administration. Let's lay down some foundational truths. Most presidents get the nominees they've selected. The Senate confirmation process can sometimes be turbulent, but more often than not, it works out in the president's favor. But Turbulence Watch is an important part of this story. So, how does Pete Hegseth stand this week on the Turbulence Index? Scott?
There's indication things are stabilizing. Some indications of that. He concluded his afternoon here with a meeting with the more moderate Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, who has a history of defying Donald Trump on key votes. But most of what he's done here over the past 24 to 48 hours is try to resuscitate what had been a listing candidacy. He made some progress with Joni Ernst, the former service member, the Iowa senator who has distinctive heft on issues involving the military. Ernst has said now she will support him through the process. She stopped short of saying she'd vote for Pete Hegseth, but a more supportive statement than she was giving last week when she said simply that they had a meeting and that the meeting was productive. Lindsey Graham of South Carolina also spoke to CBS News today, saying Pete Hegseth seems to be on a good trajectory now. He also said if allegations against Hegseth remain anonymous, they will not be a deal breaker with Republicans at confirmation hearings. Take a listen to more of what Lindsey Graham had to say. Your statement about Pete Hegseth, anonymous complaints.
Nobody should be tried by anonymous complaints, no matter what party you're in.
Is that a line in the sand for you?
Yeah, I think it should be a line in the sand for every American, that you need to come forward and the person being accused of something has a chance to confront their accuser.
So Pete Hegseth is situated better than he was a week ago when he was answering questions about those allegations of alcohol abuse and sexual misconduct, which he has denied unequivocally. But Major, you know this better than anybody. There's a long time till those confirmation hearings. They are 4 or 5 weeks away minimum, and this thing is just getting started.
Speaking of just getting started, Tulsi Gabbard is just getting started in her process of meeting and greeting senators. She has been selected by President-elect Trump to be the incoming director of National Intelligence. Any early read on that?
So far, she has met with the most loyal, potentially, of the Trump allies in the Republican Senate conference. I mean, she is meeting with those who have no history of defying Donald Trump on big things. So the early read is difficult to get because she's yet to meet with those who may be dissenting voices, yet to meet with any of the Democrats, and yet to meet with those moderate Republicans who've defied Trump in the past. We've been questioning Gabbard as she's walked these hallways about her previous visit with ousted Syrian leader Assad, about her criticism she's getting from fellow House members, or former fellow House members, that she echoes Putin's talking points or Russian talking points. She really has not addressed those questions head on. Let's see what she says after she meets with those senators who are not always such devotees to President-elect Trump.
And very quickly, Scott, next week, RFK Jr. will come up to the Senate, true?
Yeah, the latest reporting is he'll take his first set of meetings here next week before the Senate breaks for the holiday. It is noteworthy, isn't it, Major, that three of the most turbulent picks, to use your term, Tulsi Gabbard, Kash Patel, the would-be FBI director, and Pete Hegseth are all here at once, which really does dilute the impact of each. We'll see if RFK Jr. is here on his own or if his presence is diluted as well.
Scott McFarland on Capitol Hill. Our thanks as always.
Thank you.
All right, O'Keefe joins us now from West Palm Beach, Florida. Ed, always good to see you as the sun begins to set there. How does the Trump transition team feel about how things are positioned with Pete Hegseth this week as compared to last?
They feel far more confident about his chances at this point, Major, most especially the president-elect himself and the public statements he's made over the weekend and in the days since, suggesting that Hegseth is holding on, demonstrating a will to fight, and has clarified a few things. I think that interview with Fox last night and the fact that he went out of his way to suggest he has no issue with women in combat means he's been listening to the concerned Republican senators that had been speaking with him, not only about his past public statements about whether or not women should be in combat, but perhaps on broader issues regarding sexual assault in the ranks. Joni Ernst really does seem to have had an influence on him, given the statement that she put out that suggested he understood the value of men and women in uniform and then would be working on trying to curb sexual assault in the ranks. She herself, the first female combat veteran to serve in the Senate, and has said she was a victim and survivor of sexual assault. So if that was the biggest stumbling block when it comes to Hegseth so far, they've cleared it. We'll see whether other Republicans have broader issues with his qualifications or his background, his ability to run such a complex, vast organization. But with 6 weeks to go, for now at least, Ernst has taken the spotlight off of her by signaling that she's fine with him continuing, at least for now.
And Ed, I find it fascinating how you phrase that, and I wonder if, from your vantage point, you think that Pete Hegseth's stature and trajectory is kind of a prism for other potentially difficult confirmation battles facing the Trump transition. And here's what I mean. Pete Hegseth, as you said, has clarified or revised previous comments he made about women in combat roles, or what his level of sensitivity to sexual assault in the military was. And the prism, I wonder, is many of those nominated by President-elect Trump have previous statements that are very aggressive, and they go into these things saying, we're going to make the bureaucracies bend to our will because we have a mandate and we have the American public behind President-elect Trump, et cetera, et cetera. Then they meet the senators, and the Senate begins to enforce its will. The advise and consent process begins to shape them in different ways. That's how this works, but I think it's interesting with the aggressiveness that President-elect Trump's picks sometimes have, coming with the counter-aggressiveness of the Senate confirmation process.
Which is why it's going to be really difficult for skeptics to believe either side, right?
Right.
Can you believe Pete Hegseth when he says he's not going to have issue with this? Not necessarily, because, you know, even the president-elect said it himself in that NBC interview on Sunday. I can tell you one thing now, but you know politicians will turn around and do something else later. He's not wrong about that. The other example from the last 24 hours or so was when Kash Patel, the FBI pick, went to see John Cornyn, the Senate Judiciary Committee member. He was asked by reporters, well, what did he say to you about blowing up the FBI or not, you know, rearranging it?
Right.
And Cornyn walked out and said, well, I think if you were to talk to him, you would understand it was just conjecture. Well, fine, but that means that it took conjecture to get the attention of the president-elect, not some professional background in the subject matter that you would oversee, not some professional experience or lived experience that qualifies you for it. It was simply Trump saw you on TV saying some interesting things, and he put you at the top of the pile. And the Senate, as you said, will spend the next several weeks trying to mold and shape these nominees to their liking. If they got issues with them, one or two or maybe three of these aren't going to make it. And that's standard. That's about average. Obama had this issue. Trump 1 had this issue. Biden had this issue. And Trump 2 inevitably will, too.
Ed O'Keefe, as always, thank you very much. The task force investigating the assassination attempts against President-elect Trump released its final report today and found that the attempt on his life in Butler, Pennsylvania was, quote, preventable. The bipartisan group of House lawmakers detailed several failures on and before the July 13th assassination attempt, doing so in a 180-page report. It also made several recommendations. Among those, reducing the strain on Secret Service capabilities by lowering the number of individuals that the Secret Service actually protects. Turning now to Pennsylvania, the suspect charged in the murder of United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson was denied bail at a hearing today. Luigi Mangione is now fighting extradition to New York. During his appearance today, shackled and shouting, this is what he had to say as he entered the courthouse.
Completely out of touch and an insult to the intelligence of the American people.
Our Anna Schechter has been following the case and joins us now. Anna, it was a bit hard to hear all of that, but there were other things said and mannerisms and attitudes struck by this defendant to be charged. What did we learn today?
That's right, Major. It was quite a dramatic day in court today. You just saw him there shouting something about it being an insult to the intelligence of the American people. Then inside court, he was acting erratically. He raised his eyebrows, defiant, and at one point started speaking to the judge. His lawyer had to tell him to please be quiet. He was denied bail and was angry about that, and he is refusing to make this extradition easy. He is fighting it. And so what happens now is the Manhattan District Attorney, Alvin Bragg, who has already filed murder charges, he is now seeking a warrant from Governor Kathy Hochul of New York to facilitate this extradition. She has to file that with Pennsylvania Governor Shapiro. Now, there is a lot of momentum to get this done, so I imagine that she will do this quickly. But this could delay this for several weeks because paperwork has to be filed. I think prosecutors and investigators were hoping that he would not fight this and therefore facilitate a quicker transfer from Pennsylvania to New York so they can get this going and have this wheel continue to move, because they do believe that they have the right man. They have the person who pulled the trigger.
And as you know better than most, there's been tremendous speculation about a possible motive. Let's get the speculation off the screen and move to what investigators believe they have learned that is provable thus far.
At this point, investigators are homing in on the 3-page handwritten document that they recovered on his person, in which he describes grievances against corporate America, particularly citing United Healthcare as one of the most profitable companies in the U.S. And he complained about companies like United Healthcare putting profit over patient care. This jives with what they found at the crime scene. The bullets and the casings had the words deny, delay, depose. So very early on Wednesday, by about noon, they had recovered those bullets and they saw those words written there. So they knew that it had something to do with a grievance about how insurance companies handle claims. What's surprising here is you have an individual who had means. It was not that he was personally in some fight over trying to get coverage. It was more of his being inspired by the Unabomber, for example. He's written a positive review about Ted Kaczynski's book online, and he had a presence online kind of glorifying that kind of a worldview. And in that handwritten letter that he had on his person, essentially justifying his actions, he said something to the effect of, I'm the only one to take this seriously in an honest way, essentially trying to justify taking matters as he perceived them into his own hands, and prosecutors will say committed this heinous crime in cold blood.
Anna, the governor of Pennsylvania, Josh Shapiro, made some comments last night in regards to this idea that there might have been some justification in the grievances expressed by this defendant. Let's take a listen.
In a civil society, we are all less safe when ideologues engage in vigilante justice. In some dark corners, this killer is being hailed as a hero. Hear me on this. He is no hero. The real hero in this story is the person who called 911 at McDonald's this morning.
To that last point that the governor made, Anna, it's been something I've seen today that those who were at that McDonald's are fearful now because they're getting some sort of blowback for participating in the discovery of this defendant and assisting authorities.
That's right. The very people who, they are the reason why we are getting closer to buttoning this case up. They are the reason that the perpetrator was caught, and yet they themselves are receiving death threats. It's been this backward thing that's bubbled up online where, yes, you have a CEO with a very high compensation package. Also, yes, he was murdered in cold blood. And so what Shapiro was doing is tamping down on this sort of grotesque perversion of the facts as if it would be the victim's fault, which, of course, it wasn't.
Anna Schechter, thank you so very much. Many Syrians are celebrating the fall of the Assad regime in that country. Israel strikes targets inside that country at the very same time. There's a lot going on. The latest on the unrest in the Middle East, and a question many people are asking: what comes next? We'll try to answer that, a little bit at least. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. President-elect Trump has sounded kind of cautious about the ongoing events in Syria, saying it's not the U.S. fight presently. Meanwhile, President Biden has sort of taken a mini victory lap, suggesting the fall of the Assad regime is a reflection of weakened Russian influence there as a result of U.S. and European support for Ukraine in that war with Russia. Meanwhile, Israel has carried out airstrikes in the country, did so overnight. It targeted Syrian military facilities that have long possessed chemical weapons and long-range missiles. Israeli troops also seized a border buffer zone for the first time in more than half century. Charlie Taggett joins us now from the Pentagon. Charlie, a lot has been going on. The Pentagon is clearly watching all of it. Catch us up on the most recent developments and how the Pentagon views this very up-for-grabs moment in the history of Syria.
Well, first of all, we have to remember there are 900 U.S. forces already in Syria, and they've been there for more than 10 years. But I'll get to that in just a minute, because you mentioned those Israeli airstrikes that have been happening over the past 48 hours, because that's significant. And I just wrote down some of the target lists. This comes from Israeli officials: heavy weapons depots, air assets, naval assets, air defenses, chemical weapons facilities, cruise missiles, surface-to-air missiles, surface-to-sea missiles, fighter jets, helicopters. They're essentially obliterating all of what was left of the Syrian military so it doesn't fall into the hands of militants or the wrong people. Now, in terms of whether or not America is going to be involved, America is already involved. I mentioned the 900 forces there. A few days ago, CENTCOM, that's the region, Central Command, that controls that area, called in one of the largest wave of airstrikes that we've seen in months inside Syria, striking potential ISIS targets, camps and hideouts. But we're talking about 75 strikes, and we use B-52s, F-15s, A-10 aircraft. So the United States is very much involved. What we don't know yet is there are so many moving parts there. You have U.S.-backed Kurdish Syrian Defense Forces. They're the Kurds. And then you've got this new militant, not new militant group, this militant group that is now ostensibly in charge of running Syria. That's what we don't know yet.
And, Charlie, you know the region well. You can see it on the map there, ladies and gentlemen. Syria geographically is enormously important to the fate of Jordan. It's enormously important to the fate of Iraq. The Turks have tremendous interest. The Saudis are interested parties. The Russians have an air base there and a warm water port there. Everyone has interest there, which means the United States, of course, has interest there. And when the Israelis and the United States are conducting airstrikes at the same time, you know that there is tremendous, not just tangential, but ongoing interest in the fate of Syria.
Yeah, everything goes to Syria or through Syria. You know, the Israelis even claim some victory to the downfall of Bashar al-Assad's regime, because they essentially argue that they got rid of Hezbollah. Hezbollah was a very powerful group inside Syria working on behalf of the regime. Iran was propping up the regime. Russia, as you mentioned, was propping up the regime. They turned tail. What is stunning is how quickly this happened. You know, this happened in less than 2 weeks. The Turks are involved as well. The United States is involved and will continue to be involved for some time because it's just too critical. There are sort of bad neighbors all over that area, and everything goes through Syria. It's a reason. I mean, the United States has a base in Syria, Al-Tanf. You know, the American forces have been there for more than 10 years, ostensibly an anti-ISIS, but in recent months they've been going after Iranian-backed militias who have been attacking U.S. troops or attempting to attack U.S. troops. So, you know, Syria is critical. You can't ignore that or let it fall into the wrong hands. Remember, it was in all of this chaos that ISIS was born between Iraq and Syria, and they don't want to see that happen again.
Indeed. Charlie Daggett at the Pentagon, thank you very much. Here's something else related to this on the margins. 8 years after police started investigating him, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu took the witness stand at long last in his corruption trial, doing so today. Netanyahu's testimony is expected to last in this trial for weeks. This trial began, believe it or not, 4 years ago. Netanyahu is charged with bribery, fraud, and breach of trust. The charges arise from allegations he gave diplomatic support to a Hollywood producer in exchange for gifts. Israel's longest-serving prime minister has denied all wrongdoing and called the charges, quote, an ocean of absurdness. President Biden tries to boost his economic legacy. There's a question. A little too late? Why some Democrats are slamming the president for letting President-elect Trump appear to occupy center stage, not just here, but abroad. More on that next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. The presidential election we just had was in one way a kind of a referendum on Biden-Harris economic policies. Didn't work out so well for the Harris campaign. Even so, President Biden today touted his economic record, and he said it was better than he got credit for, acknowledging, though, that prices were a key factor in President-elect Trump's win. Here's some of what the president had to say.
Next month, my administration will end and a new administration will begin. Most economists agree the new administration is going to inherit a fairly strong economy, at least at the moment.
Our Caitlin Huey-Burns joins us from the White House, and lots of presidents have learned that what economists think about the economy and what voters think about the economy often diverge, and voters get the last word. Even so, the administration does want to say that there is going to be a legacy from the accomplishments, as they describe them, and that legacy will last long after President Biden departs. That was part of the remarks today, right, Caitlin?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Major. As you mentioned, this election was really centered on the economy, and what we saw on paper did not match voters' views of the economy. That has been made clear, and the administration has essentially acknowledged as much. But what today was about was, first of all, trying to kind of claim the last word on the economy and explain sort of preemptively take credit for economic successes that could come later in Trump's administration. And this current administration is trying to argue that they, in their words, planted the seeds for the economy that is to come. Part of that, they argue, is that benefits from the Inflation Reduction Act, the CHIPS Act, won't be really seen or felt until maybe next year or later. But a lot of this, too, is trying to kind of cement Biden's legacy as his term comes to an end in just about 6 weeks from now. But you could argue that a lot of what we heard today, the touted perceived economic successes that this administration believes they've had, versus how voters felt. A lot of this felt like what he had said in campaign speeches before. So the question that we had posed to the administration today and Biden's economic advisor was, where was that disconnect? What could you have done differently? And really the sentiment is that they did acknowledge that prices were high, that voters' concerns about inflation, even though the number itself was coming down, just wasn't felt by Americans.
Caitlin Huey-Burns from the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you very much.
We're tired of watching as we suffer while we allow people to come in illegally.
That's Carrie Lake. She lost her bid for the Senate in Arizona, but there are now reports this vocal proponent of strict border security policies could become President-elect Trump's next ambassador to Mexico. Our political reporter panel will weigh in on her potential post and many other matters. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. It's great to have you with us. Kari Lake ran unsuccessfully for governor of Arizona, unsuccessfully for United States Senate in Arizona. Losses like that typically don't endear you to President-elect Trump. Even so, Lake is a contender, apparently a serious contender to be Trump's pick to be ambassador of Mexico. That is according to a new article you can find on Semaphore, which also touches on Lake's policy positions and her relationship, fraught though it may be, with President-elect Trump. Its writer, Shelby Talcott, joins us now. She is a politics reporter at Semaphore. Also with us, Laura Davison, politics editor for Bloomberg. All right, we're going to get to Kari Lake in a minute, I promise, but shameless self-promotion for CBS News, because moments ago, our newly minted CBS News reporter Jennifer Jacobs and Finn Gomez reported as such. President-elect Trump is considering Kimberly Guilfoyle to be ambassador to Greece. That would be a semi-family member, dating for some long period of time, Don Jr. How do we assess these possibilities? Shelby?
You know, I think it's not surprising particularly when you look at posts like ambassador positions. And Donald Trump has a history of picking either family members or people close to the family for various positions. So it is not surprising that he might be continuing this tradition in his second term.
Laura, politics is a family business, and loyalty within family is a key qualifier, so it appears.
Yes, and we've seen, for years, Kimberly Guilfoyle was in sort of the center circle of Trump's orbit. She's now been moved out. You've noticed she hasn't been in some family photos. She hasn't been on stage at some of these things. So this is a way to sort of have her within the administration, but just an ocean away, and Greece is an attractive place to go.
No doubt. Kari Lake, how serious is this based on your reporting, Shelby? Because I hear different things, that she can't get her phone calls returned, or at least initially. Maybe she can now. Where are things?
Yeah, I'm told that she is a top contender, and that does not mean that she is ultimately going to get picked, right? Especially with Donald Trump, nothing is official until he announces this. That there have been situations during this transition where he has actually asked one person, and then there have been phone calls made and another person has been picked. So nothing is official until he announces it. But she is a serious contender. Donald Trump has liked how strong of an ally she's been, despite the fact that she has repeatedly lost some of these statewide races. And he also likes that she echoes his staunch immigration beliefs. And so that is a big factor in these conversations.
Laura, how do you think the Senate would regard Kari Lake as a potential ambassador to Mexico, in light of something she did in this last campaign, which was secretly record a member of the Republican Party in Arizona and then leak that recording, suggesting it was an attempt to bribe her? That leader of the Arizona Republican Party stepped down. Everyone thought it was within the confines of typical political conversations, edgy, but not a bribe. But what they really remembered is, Kari Lake, what'd you do that for? How can you be trusted? How can someone in a crucial diplomatic post be invested with the kind of trust that comes with that?
She certainly does not have a ton of really close allies in the Senate. So that's going to be a challenge. However, there are probably other more embattled picks, Pete Hegseth, for example, who are probably going to get that first line of scrutiny. Also important to remember that the ambassadorship to Mexico, that's not going to be a really just fun, happy-go-lucky job. There are tariffs to consider. There's, all the things that Trump has proposed to do with Mexico. That's going to be a real tough job. And so just finding someone at all who wants to take that may be a bit of a challenge. And, having someone who's a firebrand like Kari Lake may be helpful in that.
And Shelby, digging down a little bit more on the Kari Lake thing, the ambassador to Mexico is going to be overshadowed by the president, by Tom Homan, by Stephen Miller, by Kristi Noem. They're going to be like fifth in charge of this policy and all the implications vis-a-vis Mexico.
And so there is an argument to be made that, especially in a Donald Trump presidency in which he plans to focus aggressively on immigration, that perhaps there will be a number of other people who will be taking priority on some of these issues. And so then maybe this is a less serious post than it would normally be. But I still think, of course, if Kari Lake or whoever ultimately ends up getting tapped as ambassador to Mexico, they're still going to be in the mix in those conversations. It just might be that there are a number of other people who are in the mix before her.
And I name-check Kristi Noem because she is the nominee to be for Department of Homeland Security. Laura, I want to ask you about something we discussed with Ed O'Keefe earlier. So Pete Hegseth is now recharacterizing his opposition, stated bluntly in a podcast only a little while ago about women in combat roles in the military, now going on Fox and saying, oh, I have tremendous respect for all women warriors in the U.S. military. That feels to me like the Senate shaping this nominee, even though lots of these folks come in and say, well, the Senate's not going to change me. I'm going to be the aggressive Trumper I've always have been. Maybe not.
Maybe not. And perhaps one in particular senator may be influencing him, specifically Joni Ernst, who has been sort of the most vocal and sort of, being hesitant about his candidacy.
Non-committal, yes.
And she's been very concerned both about women's role in the military. Her daughter is in the Army, as well as the role that sexual assault has played in sort of limiting some of women's options there. So this, is clearly, as you see him pivoting, he did yesterday notch a pretty important win. He didn't get her saying, OK, I will vote for you, but she said, I will support him through this process, and I hope for a fair hearing. So that was a really 180 from where we were just a couple days ago. And Trump also coming out and supporting.
And Shelby, related to this, Ed O'Keefe brought this up in an earlier conversation. Kash Patel has a conversation with Senator John Cornyn of Texas, and then the reporters ask him, well, what about taking away the FBI headquarters or from D.C. or shutting it down entirely? Senator Cornyn says, well, that was conjecture. So again, bold statements before you start working through this confirmation process, things get sanded down at the edges.
Yeah, and I think,
to put it mildly,
I think there's always a push and pull when it comes to these nominees. You say one thing, and then you realize that you can only lose 3 lawmakers in this confirmation process, and so maybe you have to backtrack on a few things, or you have to moderate your opinions. But I actually think Kash Patel is not going to face as difficult of a nomination as some of the other contenders, because when you talk to Republicans, it is not a minority opinion, the belief that Republicans have that the FBI is politicized. And so I think he might have an easier confirmation process than some people believe.
Shelby Talcott, Laura Davison, thank you so much, as always, for coming in. Appreciate it. President-elect Trump plans to deport, he says, up to 11 million undocumented immigrants. How much will that cost? A look at the impact many say will go far beyond the billions needed to just carry out these removals. Other downstream economic effects will be part of our conversation. That's next, right here on America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. A recent report from the American Immigration Council found that mass deportations, as proposed by the incoming Trump administration, could have massive effects on the federal budget and possible damaging effects to the U.S. economy. This report found that a one-time operation to deport all undocumented immigrants in the United States could cost as much, or at least, $315 billion. Nevertheless, President-elect Trump believes the country, in his words, doesn't have a choice.
Is it your plan to deport everyone who is here illegally over the next 4 years?
Well, I think you have to do it, and it's a very tough thing to do. But you have to have, you have rules, regulations, laws. They came in illegally.
The executive director for the American Immigration Council, Jeremy Robbins, joins us now from Studio 57 in New York. Jeremy, it's great to see you. Thanks for joining us. Break down that $315 billion number. Where did it come from? What are those costs?
Yeah, thank you, Major. Thanks for having me. The costs of this are staggering, and they come in about 4 principal buckets. First, we have to find the people who we're going to deport. We then have to go into communities to arrest them. We have to detain them while we figure out, are they people who should be deported? And then we have to send them home. Because let's be very honest, we right now are deporting hundreds of thousands of people, and we're doing that by focusing on violent criminals. So when you're talking about mass deportations, we're not talking about deporting violent criminals. You're talking about deporting people, the majority of whom have been here more than 15 years. The vast majority, almost all of whom are working or in school. And so we're going to have to go into communities and find people.
And your report talks about detention, facilities, costs, person power. Explain that.
So right now, we have about as much detention capacity to detain about 50,000 undocumented immigrants while they're being sent to waiting their decisions to be deported or to be let in. If you're talking about deporting 13 million people, just think about what that scale is. If you look at every inmate in prison or jail in this country, you're talking about 1.9 million people. Now you're talking about 13 million people. We need to build new facilities. You need to staff them. It's expensive. Even if you did an open air facility that wasn't, and you think about the concerns of what that could be, they're hugely expensive. And so this report was actually quite conservative because we used the costs that we have to detain people now. But when you think about how expensive and difficult it is to build something of that magnitude that quickly, it's going to be enormous. The numbers we're talking about to deport all undocumented immigrants, if you took all that we spend in the entire world on cancer research, this is 18 times that. This is 79 years of funding Head Start, and again, not to deport violent criminals who we are already targeting for deportation. This is to deport a lot of people who have been in this country for decades, who are working, who are by and large law-abiding citizens who happen to have come here illegally. And let me be very clear, we need to have a system where people are coming here legally, where we have control over who comes here and who doesn't, and we have a process of figuring out who those people are and quickly. Right now, it takes 6 years for many people to figure out whether they can get their asylum. It needs to take months or weeks. We need a system that is real, but a large-scale deportation of this magnitude that would deport 4% of the entire population would have devastating economic impacts and be hugely expensive to undertake.
Jeremy, let's take on that economic impact at a different level. You know, when you go to a Trump rally, and we have done this with our embedded reporters, our reporters, there's a perception among those in the Trump political base that most illegal or undocumented immigrants are wards of the state, that they're receiving some manner of government benefits in perpetuity. But your report talks about them as workers, them as taxpayers, and that if they were deported, quite separate from the cost of doing that, there would be an economic impact as well.
You did a great segment earlier this hour talking about how voters were really concerned about the economy and inflation, and that was the main issue driving people to the polls. If you look at our industries, our service industries, our agriculture industry, our hospitality industry, our construction industry, if you deport a massive part of that workforce, if you get rid of half the people who are working to pick our crops and bring vegetables and fruits to market, prices will get more expensive. If you think about how hard it is to build homes and why housing is so expensive, and you get rid of the roofers and other key workers in the construction industry, it is going to get more expensive to build homes. And then you think of the fact that if you get rid of 4% of the population who have massive buying power, you're talking about 11 million people, about 13 million people who collectively have about $250 billion a year that they inject into this economy, that will have devastating impacts on Americans of all stripes.
Jeremy Robbins, thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Major.
In a win for the Biden administration, a federal judge has blocked the $25 billion proposed merger between grocery store giants Kroger and Albertsons. The Federal Trade Commission successfully argued in court that this merger would erode competition and lead to higher prices. Kroger disputed that and argued its acquisition of Albertsons would do exactly the opposite. They also argued the merger would help them compete against Walmart and Amazon. Congress only has 10 days left to figure out government funding before a shutdown deadline approaches. Why Speaker Mike Johnson will most certainly have to lean on House Democrats to keep the government's lights on. That's next. You're watching America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Congress finds itself in two different work worlds. On the Senate side, there is the work world of the incoming Trump administration, looking at those designated to fill cabinet positions and meeting them on Capitol Hill. On the House side and on the Senate side, there's the lame duck Congress world, the work of here and now. And a big part of that is a race to avert a government shutdown right before the holidays. Funding is currently on track to run out just 10 days from today. But here's the good news. Lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, on both sides of the Capitol, say at this point they're still confident the government will remain open past that deadline of December 20th. Nicole Killian joins us now from Capitol Hill. Nicole, what is the basis and reliability of that confidence?
Well, I would say nobody's sounding the alarm bells just yet, and certainly Congress has a lot to chew on between President-elect Trump's nominees being here on Capitol Hill. Of course, there's also the defense authorization package that they're trying to get through, and then, of course, government funding, which is critical. But that being said, negotiations continue, and as you mentioned, funding does run out December 20th. You know, Speaker Johnson, up to this point, has indicated that he supports potentially some type of extension into early next year, maybe until March. There are others who would prefer something more long-term than that. Leader Schumer indicating as much to reporters earlier this afternoon. There's also the issue of whether or not disaster aid will be included in this. President Biden, of course, had submitted a request to Congress for upwards of $100 billion to deal with relief from hurricanes Milton and Helene, as well as other severe storms and natural disasters that have occurred in different parts of the country over the last several months. So all of that is still under discussion, but there is hope that there can be some type of resolution, certainly before December 20th.
And on the House side, Republicans would have to rely, would they not, Nicole, at least on some support from Democrats?
Well, possibly, because there are certainly more hardline members, particularly members of the House Freedom Caucus, who feel like there should not be another single cent spent, particularly with respect to this issue of disaster relief. But that being said, we know that that is a key priority for the outgoing administration, and certainly for many members of Congress whose districts were impacted, particularly by those very intense storms, Helene in particular. So that being said, many lawmakers do see it as a priority. Again, it's a matter of will they sign off on that full amount or try to cut it down.
And also quickly, Nicole, there's this question, and you mentioned it, how long this spending authority would last. If you just take it into March, Republicans and the incoming Trump administration would have to deal with that right away with very tight margins.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, obviously, the House will lose a number of members in the new year, the Republican majority, in terms of people like former Congressman Matt Gaetz, GOP Conference Chair Lee Stefanik, Congressman Mike Waltz. But that being said, I think the Speaker feels relatively confident that he can kind of sew this together in the best way possible. You know, he actually was the one who had pushed for that December 20th deadline because he didn't want some kind of Christmas omnibus where lawmakers are here up until the holidays. So he seems pretty committed to try to reach some type of resolution over the next couple of days.
And Nicole, there was an episode revolving around Senator McConnell today. Catch us up on that.
Yeah, well, Leader McConnell suffered a fall as he was leaving the Republican Senate GOP lunch earlier today. A spokesperson confirms that he did sustain a cut to his face and also sprained his wrist. However, he has been cleared to resume his schedule, you know, in terms of talking to other Senate leaders like John Thune. He said that Leader McConnell is fine. We also talked to John Barrasso, the GOP conference chair, who was present when this happened, and he said that Leader McConnell seemed okay, was well within his faculties. But for many of those who are aware of Leader McConnell's health challenges, this isn't the first time that he has fallen. Of course, he is a polio survivor, so that at times has affected his gait. But at least for now, Major, it seems like he's all right.
With all the latest information from Capitol Hill, Nicole Killian, as always, we thank you. That does it for today. We'll be back with another edition of America Decides tomorrow at 5 p.m. Eastern. The Daily Report starts right now.